We have three days of getting settled, three different gentlemen from three different islands. First, sitting right next to me is Rick Eckert from the island of Kauai, the utility in Kauai. In the middle is Kyle Dada, who is the Ulupono Initiative on the Big Island, right? And at the far end is Sanjay Bose from the Isle of Manhattan. You had you wondering there for a second where I was going with that. From Con Edison. And all three of you have been involved with energy and resilience and preparing for the worst case scenarios, and also dealing with the worst case scenarios. And you've all worked with Puerto Rico, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And Sanjay, let's start with you. You've been involved at Con Edison for 38 years in a variety of roles, and through that you've been from 9/11 and Superstorm Sandy and the recovery in Puerto Rico, and now working here in the islands. What have you learned, certainly in Puerto Rico more recently, that could help Hawaii be prepared for some of the worst case scenarios?
So Joel, I want to stand corrected. I've been with Con Ed for 32, not 38. I started when I was 2.
Of course, sorry.
First, before I get started, it was an immense effort, and I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to the women and men from all the utilities, including New York Power Authority and my company. And then soon after that, I was involved to go out there and assess before our crews went out there to actually help with the immediate restoration and also the long-term building. So the key lessons learned is we cannot say it can never happen to us. Oh, that's impossible. We have to be prepared. We cannot just say, well, that's Hawaii, it's an island. It had happened to us in Sandy. We never thought we'd see 6 feet of water in Manhattan. I never, in my 32 years working in Con Edison, both in operations and engineering, ever realized that night as water was coming in that I would have to deploy boats to rescue our substation folks. So one of the key lessons I learned from driving through and flying over Puerto Rico was it's easy to criticize what's there and why it failed. Because way back when the electric system in Puerto Rico was built, it was built to a design standard. Do we have to continuously go back and keep looking at it and then do some wise investments to actually strengthen it so that we are cognizant of what's happening in terms of climate change and other weather-related anomalies? And if you do that, then we have to convince our customers, our regulators, and our company leadership like myself that it's wise to invest in things that have a very low probability but high impact. And what can we do in terms of recovery? So you cannot really build, in my world, there's nothing called as bulletproof. It's bullet resistant. All you need is a bigger round. So you have to make some wise investments and have the ability to recover fast. So in Con Edison's part from Sandy, we learned the customers will only take about 3 days. After 3 days of power outage, where they cannot charge their cell phones or stay in touch with people, they feel that they are being unsafe. And after that, even if a meteorite hits you, nobody cares, right? So that's some of the biggest lessons learned, and also have the ability to share. So we are here with Kyle and other folks that the knowledge we have learned, we don't hold on to it, right? All you have to do is make a phone call, and the disasters we have gone through and whatever we have built to prevent the next one, we will be more than willing to share. All the utilities in the US, including abroad, will do that.
I mean, I think one of the lessons is that when it happens really quickly, and the preparation time is almost nil.
Well, that's not really true. So in our company, we call it the Emergency Response Group. We've adopted the Incident Command System after 9/11. We do a lot of drills. I know these drills cannot always encompass everything that can happen, but in your mindset, you're ready. So we have something called as a Corporate Emergency Response Center. So you have logistics, you have all kinds put together in one room, you're trained for it, you continuously drill on it. It's like math. You know, you don't do it, it becomes an infrequent evolution, then you can even add 2 + 2. So I think that's key. And there are many lessons learned from many events around the mainland and around the world that the emergency response group can actually focus and be ready for it. So at least you are mentally prepared. And one of the things I was talking to somebody outside, the first thing intuitively that occurs when something bad happens is to run into it and start fixing it. The first thing we have to do is do damage assessment and do a controlled recovery. And that really helps. And so if you're prepared for it, you're much better off mentally.
Well, let's move over to Rick, because Kauai had about 26 years ago, September 92, had the worst hurricane in recorded history, Hurricane Iniki. What's happened since then that's maybe prepared Kauai for and could help all the islands prepare for their future?
You know, it's interesting. KIUC just completed a hurricane response exercise last week. That, as Sanjay indicated, that is a very important component of preparedness, is rehearsing and understanding the playbook. I also found that we still have about 20 employees who went through Iniki, and I witnessed some continuing PTSD over that.
Seriously, what does that look like? Or is that just a line, or is there implications of?
It's a very significant event to go through. A lot of emotion, a lot of interpersonal relationships, and it's a small community, and everybody cares. But a major takeaway from Iniki that has caused us to configure our system differently. We lost almost a third of our transmission during that storm. We came back from that, 80% of our transmission line. We regard the transmission system as a critical backbone, even though our generation is very distributed and we don't hang a lot of few contingency on generation. We need that transmission. 80% of our structures are now steel. 20% of the transmission structures that are wood are storm guide, which means you've got guys in two different directions.
Guy wires that hold things down,
Yes.
anchor things down.
So when the storm comes in, it'll support that structure in multiple phases of the storm. And then once again, our generation is that we've developed. We have solar. We have a diversity of fuel: solar, biomass, hydro. We still have our legacy generation, which is diesel, for backup, and we use a high-efficiency naphtha unit.
I imagine that it's got to be this interesting balance between hardening the target, keeping things sturdy and rigid and able to withstand these forces, and also keeping it flexible so it can go with the winds, as it were, or whatever things are. Is that sort of the balancing act that you have?
So I believe it's easier to, the system, the transmission pole line is more resilient, is very resilient and wind resistant. Something even more important to remember though, and when we take this away from Puerto Rico, is vegetation management. Because where you might have a pole line that can stand 130 mile an hour wind, if you've got an albizia going through a span of it, it'll take down multiple structures. There's just simply no way of guarding against that. So vegetation management is something that we view as being very critical.
So we've been talking about hurricanes so far, and hurricanes are not the only threat to the Hawaiian Islands. There's sea level rise, tsunamis, I think, also, and I heard about a hurricane. I mean, a volcano somewhere going on. Kyle, first of all, what's your sense of whether the islands are prepared, and in particular Oahu?
Well, so it's something of great concern, I think, for all of us, is that what happened in Puerto Rico will happen here. We know climate change is real. We know that these climate events are coming, whether it's a tsunami or whether it's a typhoon or a hurricane. And we're not doing the kind of joint planning we need to really look at how our infrastructures are going to work together to be able to recover from the storm. And I'll give you an example. You know, the Board of Water Supply, which supplies Honolulu, has 20 major pumps and has backup power for 7 of them. That means when the whole grid goes down, they can only supply about half of the water needed for the urban Honolulu area. That means you're only going to focus on low-lying areas. And if that was to persist for 3 days, I don't think it's going to be about our cell phones that we're worried about. We're going to have a full-scale public health crisis. And that's not the Board of Water Supply's fault or the power company's fault. It's that we have to start to look at what is the value of having an extra day of recovery time? What is that value to us? What are the different things we would do in the grid? How might we apply microgrids, whether the utility owns them or customers own them? How would we work with our other infrastructures in telecommunications, in the ports, with the water company? And where's the cost benefit of that? And once we see that, then we can go to the PUC, we can go to the county council and say, we should be making these investments. Let's talk about how we socialize them. But in the absence of this kind of joint planning, and it's especially important right now because we're just about to undergo significant grid modernization, and the utility is starting to really work on, in this county, what are they going to do going forward. It's an excellent time to look at what's the incremental cost above and beyond what you do for reliability that you would pay to have resilience. And shouldn't we make those investments, and here's the business case for that.
And is that conversation taking place?
Well, I think it's a question that we need to have a vessel for that. There's the Partnership for Pacific Resilience, which at least kicked off the conversation. This morning, in the second session, there was a lot of energy around the workshop participants starting to have the conversation. So we all know it's a conversation we want to have. And again, everyone's doing their particular kuleana, their actual specific planning. We're just not planning across the infrastructure. So yes, I think especially for whoever the next governor is, this is something important. And you know, the new county office around the Office of Resilience, this is really the conversation that we need to have in the planning sense, and then actually take it to the regulators, but also bring in the customers. Because one thing we learned from Puerto Rico is that you don't put all the burden on the utility. You can actually reach out to your customers and say, what are you going to do? How do we work together with you? And that really can save a lot of costs and also make it a real partnership between the infrastructure providers and the customers. And again, it's really to protect all of us.
So Sanjay, talk a little bit about what Con Edison has been doing post-Sandy, and perhaps even, maybe even informed by what you saw, because you were part of the rescue efforts or the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. What are some of the things that's been done in New York to make sure that the next Sandy is less destructive?
So Sandy occurred on October 29th in 2012. By November 1st, we formed a consortium with the Public Utility Commission and 15 other that included academia, environmental groups. The first thing you have to do is set a design standard. So what are we designing for? So what we did is we said we'll take the FEMA 100-year flood maps, add 2 feet to it to meet the building code, and then add another foot for future climate change. And we all agreed that that would be the design code that we will design to for flooding. And then every 5 years, we will review that and look at what are the changes that are happening and maybe start designing a little better. So once we had that, it took us it wasn't an easy task because, you have existing infrastructure And people can say raise everything. You cannot raise things on the island of Manhattan. There's space restrictions. And then we went on a series of internal, we actually are very proud of it, myself, my team. We came up with some very novel economic solutions of flood doors, gates, temporary barriers, permanent barriers, pumps. And over the next 3 years, in 2016, we actually completed spending $1 billion and doing some really innovative things, both in the transmission, distribution, generating stations. But the first thing it started was the design standard. So that's what we established.
So, Rick and Kyle, I mean, how does that work, the design standard here? It's looking at Hawaii's future when most of the critical infrastructure, power plants, wastewater treatment plants, maybe even schools and hospitals are right on the coast. Is it a matter of rethinking this, or how does the design standard even apply to retrofitting?
I think we have to look at the reality of sea level rise. And we have to ask the question, as we're modernizing the grid and as we're updating the water system, and we're looking at this infrastructure that's been around since statehood, should we move to higher ground? Should we move this infrastructure to higher ground, literally? And because that probably is the reality that we're facing. We may not be able to hold back the sea. It's because it really is rising, and you can see the maps, and it's a real conversation. And it's time for that conversation for us to address it, especially in the city and county of Honolulu. The other islands, I think, have a different topography, but this particular county has a lot of, all of Waikiki and an important portion of downtown. A lot of its load and core commercial center is actually very, very low. And we're already seeing the rise going back up through the sewers.
Yeah, well, it points to a very specific issue that needs to be addressed in an island geography. Yeah. We have limited land. And so not every island is created the same. And so matching the geography with the cost of hardening the system for public services like that is a challenge. Yeah. And Kauai is a lot simpler than Oahu, but
there is good news, because in part of it is how technology has advanced. And there's things that we can do now that we couldn't do 10 years from now. We've probably been laughed at and we envisioned. So, I've already started to see commercial proposals that for large-scale microgrids that actually make commercial sense. They're coming at a reasonable price per kilowatt hour, and they really are hardened. They can withstand these kinds of forces. You still got to place them, obviously, above where sea level is going to be, but that exists, and I think Sanjay's been exploring some other technologies that are worth discussing that really we should be looking at as part of the solutions.
Yeah. So one of the things is operational. So almost all of you here are familiar with the island of Manhattan. So right down the Battery, we actually work with the city of New York. Southern tip of Manhattan. So that's pretty low, and that really gets flooded pretty easily. So we developed these submersible underground switches, and we work with the local community and the city of New York that if there is a flood coming, we will preemptively shut down portions of that network so that we have less damage when flooding occurs. We have worked with the customers there that they will evacuate in a safe manner ahead, 72 hours ahead, so that it's a lot easier to repair something that's not energized and has exploded than, you can just pump the water out, wash it with clean water, and re-energize. So there's a combination of design, operational measures, but you have to work very closely with the government officials, the public officials, and your customers.
Well, we're going to have a forced evacuation of the stage in a minute because we're going to run out of time. And I want to get to a question in just a second, Elaine. But Rick, I imagine there's a human issue here too, because you've got, particularly if you're going to move things, you've got NIMBY issues, cultural issues, probably complacency when things don't happen. It's been years since the last hurricane, and so therefore we've forgotten about it. We'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, the employee group, which ends up being part of the first response team, you have to address their personal needs. Their family is perhaps gone through a very traumatic experience, and so we need linemen, we need employees to come in and help assess do the early out assessment. And so from a planning standpoint, we have to take care of that human element. They have to feel comfortable and safe. We also, as I understand, what happened with the Nikki. So first responders, it's a community thing. They want to help. They want to get the island back into service. They want to get back to normal. There are electric facilities, say, leaning into roadways or laying on roadways. Well, a very enthusiastic response we experienced was that out came chainsaws and out came loaders and it shoved and wadded everything up in the side of the road for public access, but that could have very easily been, at least in a temporary fashion, stood back up and energized quicker.
We're kind of at time, but let's get a quick question in, Elaine.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a two-part question in terms of overcoming significant barriers for communities and governments that are still sort of entrenched in their thinking like 100-year floods are still 100-year floods when obviously they're less than 1 year nowadays. But I think the point is more finance is always a major barrier in some of these discussions, as well as just sort of a proactive way of thinking and a prioritization of being able to look for financing opportunities or be more creative in those ways. So my question is really, what is the role of utility, government, private industry, or sort of new finance models that you're seeing are working to address these resilience issues?
That's not a quick answer, but Sanjay, you want to take that?
Yeah, so, the microgrids, and we have suggested some microgrids in Puerto Rico. One of the things we need to do is build something, and adapt to the microgrid concept so that it is beneficial on a daily basis and also serves as a resilience measure. It's almost like comparing it to a fire truck or an ambulance, right? 20 years down the road, it only has 10,000 miles, but if you could use that fire truck as a delivery truck and also make it a fire truck when you need it, if there's a quick change out, then it makes economic sense. So planning microgrids, like Kyle was saying, where to put them, does it make economic sense on a day-to-day basis and also serve as a resiliency tool, that would be the key.
I'd like to add that resilience changes the narrative that we've been having between the investor-owned utility and its customers, because it puts us back in alignment. All of us actually want to see this infrastructure put in place so that we will recover from a disaster. Everyone will see the benefit in that. And whether the utility owns it or the customers own it, it doesn't matter. We just need to have it done. And so whatever best combination there is, and will save us the most collective capital is where we're going to gravitate to. And that makes it, so that's a good place for the utility to have rate base. It's a good place for customers to put in money. And all of a sudden, instead of being like this, and all this fear that microgrids are create defection, all of a sudden microgrids are actually helping. And this other infrastructure is actually helping. So it's going to put us back in alignment. And then the financing really is, either way, if you think about it, energy infrastructure is paid for by 1 to 2 generations. That's really how it's paid for in every single country around the world. So it's really, we're going to pay for this infrastructure the same way. It's going to be spread over 1 or 2 generations. But what's different is we're going to animate more customer capital as part of the solutions. It won't all come in the utility's balance sheet, and that will be very, very helpful.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about, and these are critical issues, and we're going to be covering more on these topics in the breakouts and back on the stage over the next couple of days, but we got to get off the stage for now. So for now, please join me in thanking Sanjay, Kyle, and Rick.